We left off with a really uncomfortable and kind of gritty story of Judah and Tamar, the daughter-in-law. And the daughter got the first son and he died, and the second son and he died, and she was supposed to get the third son but didn't. And so Judah goes off to a foreign place, and she dresses up and runs ahead of him and pretends to be a prostitute, and they sleep together, and she gets pregnant, and he accuses her, and she says, well, yeah, but you're the dad, and he feels bad. And everything just kind of falls apart, and it's a really ugly story. And that brings us to chapter 39. Chapter 39 is a much more familiar story. This is the one that we always focus on. And when we look through Genesis and do lessons and sermons and devotionals, we often go through chapters 36 and 37 and skip right to 39 and kind of avoid chapter 38 because it's such an ugly story that seems to have no relevance whatsoever. But when we compare chapter 38 and 39, and this was kind of our homework assignment last week, I think, again, we can kind of compare the two scenarios and see the similarities as well as the differences. And throughout the book, God has separated the good line and the bad line, the chosen family versus the non-chosen family. And he's taken this section and looked at their heritage and the other side and looked at their heritage, and he's drawn distinct lines between the two. In chapter 38 and 39, it's almost like he's doing the same thing, except for both of these stories are within the covenant. They're both within the chosen line. They both inherit God's unconditional promise. And yet, even within that same family, we see that some are more closely following God and others are less so. And we see the story of Judah here, which I believe is probably representative of the other brothers kind of as a whole. He was the leader of them. And we see the kind of, I guess immorality is the best way to put it. They kind of take after their dad in a lot of ways, how they went after what they want. They were kind of self-absorbed. They were manipulative. They kind of worked the situation to get what they thought they wanted. And it's not a great story. And yet in chapter 39, we see the other brother, Joseph. Now, he has been betrayed at this point. He's been sold into slavery. He's taken down to Egypt, and he finds himself on being sold and enslaved to a man named Potiphar. This is a very familiar story. We're not going to go through all the details of the next couple chapters other than to pull out what I think are the relevant applications. But chapter 39, we know the story. Joseph is working for Potiphar. He's doing really well. God is blessing him. Potiphar sees this. He says, hey, I'm going to put you in charge of everything. I'm not going to worry about anything here at home other than what I eat for supper. Everything else is under your control. And so Joseph is managing everything else, and things are going really well until one day Potiphar's wife also notices how well Joseph is doing. He's a smart guy. He's attractive. He's witty. He's funny. And he has power, and all that is just too much for her to resist. And so she goes up and says, hey, why don't we sneak off to the back room and have some fun? He says, no, I don't think so. Day after day after day, this happens until finally she says, all right, all the other servants are gone. Let's do this. And Joseph says, how can I possibly do this? Sin against Potiphar, sin against God, that can't happen. She grabs his coat. He runs away. She's left with the coat. She gets mad. She doesn't like being rejected, and so Potiphar gets home. She takes the coat to her husband, says, look what that Hebrew slave tried to do to me. He tried to come and attack me, and I grabbed his coat, and when I screamed, he ran away. But you got to do something about this guy. And so Potiphar gets really angry, and he sends Joseph to jail. This is a fine story. We have a lot to learn from this morally, but what happens when we compare that to chapter 38? Now again, think of what happened in chapter 38. You had the brothers. They had all the power. They were established. They could manipulate situations. They had influence. They used that influence to manipulate people, and they got what they want according to the ability that they had. What happens when we compare that story to chapter 39 of Joseph? In chapter 39, Joseph, he's young. He is a slave. He is in a foreign land. He's still probably learning the language, maybe. And he's young. He has no control over the situation really whatsoever. But whereas the brothers manipulated to get what they wanted, Joseph behaved on a basis of morality instead. Joseph said, no, I know I have every reason to do this. She's the boss's wife. I could get in trouble if I do. I could get in trouble if I don't. It would certainly be easy for me to do this thing that she's demanding that I do, not to mention it probably appealing. She's probably attractive, I'm going to guess. I have no idea. But he said, no, I cannot do this because it would be the wrong thing to do. You never hear the other brothers say that. And finally, at the bottom, where the brothers were guided and driven and motivated by their ability to get what they wanted. Joseph was driven and motivated by the character that he had. He said, this would not be the right thing to do, sin against my master, not to mention against God himself. I can't do this thing. It would just be wrong for me to do. And again, we can see the parallel between the two stories, between the two chapters here very closely. And you can see how even within the covenant, some are following God very closely and some not so much. And yet God includes both of those in his unconditional promise. We continue through chapter 40 through 45. And again, we're going to summarize a lot of this. We're not going to go into all kinds of detail, but it details the story of God placing Joseph in a position of power in Egypt for him to be a blessing, not only to Egypt, but to all the nations. This also gives Joseph the opportunity to judge the hearts of his brothers for the sins they had committed against him. But instead of taking revenge, he offers them mercy, forgiveness, and grace. We already introduced Joseph not only in chapter 39, but earlier when he had the dreams, remember? And he has these dreams. He says, in my dreams, all the brothers came and bowed to me. He said, every knee shall bow before me of his family, of his brothers. And remember what the verse said? His father, he kept these things in mind. Or we compared it to Luke, chapter, 2, verse 19, I think it was. Kind of similar wording to where Mary pondered all these things in her heart. Keep these things in mind as we enter chapter 40. In chapter 40, Joseph is in jail, and he's, again, doing well. He's serving to the best of his ability. God is blessing. He's giving him success. And so Joseph finds himself in charge of the jail. He's second under the main jailer, but the jailer has absolute confidence and trust in Joseph, and so he's put in charge of all the prisoners. And two prisoners come in, the cupbearer and the baker, and these two prisoners have dreams. The prisoners relay their dreams to Joseph. Joseph says, well, interpretations belong to God, so let's hear them. They tell him the dreams, and Joseph says, aha, guess what, cupbearer? Your dream means that in 3 days you're going to get your job back and everything will be great. And the baker says, hey, that's a great interpretation. Let me tell you my dream too. And so he gives him, he relays his dream to Joseph, and Joseph says, this isn't quite so comfortable. You're going to have 3 days as well, but in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to get you out of jail too. Yay, says the baker. Only he's going to take you to the gallows, and you're going to be strung up, and you will be hanged. And the baker says, oh, and it wasn't so great. Sure enough, 3 days come and go, and exactly what Joseph said comes to pass. The baker is taken out, and he is hung. Sometimes I'm curious what he was hung for, or why both went to jail. The Bible doesn't tell us. We'll have to ask someday when we get there, up to heaven. But the cupbearer was restored, to his job. He was restored to his position, and he was able to continue serving the king. All this is background for the next chapter, because at the end of this chapter, Joseph says, cupbearer, when you get back to the king, will you do me a favor? He says, will you let the king know that I'm in here? I was wrongfully accused. I really shouldn't be here. I'm doing the best I can in the situation, but I'd kind of like to get out of here. If you could mention me to the king, that'd be great. Well, the cupbearer forgot. He was so excited to have his job back, a lot of drama going on maybe, who knows, who cares, but he forgot to do it. 2 more years go by, and Joseph is still in jail until the Pharaoh has his own dream. And the Pharaoh is worried about this dream. He's talking about it to people. Finally, Joseph comes to the mind of the cupbearer. The cupbearer says, hey, when I was in jail, I knew this guy, and I had a dream, and the baker had a dream, and he told us what our dreams meant, and maybe he could do the same for you. So Pharaoh pulls Joseph out of jail, gets him all cleaned up and shaved and dressed and cologne and all this stuff, and Joseph comes before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, Joseph, I've had a dream, or actually 2 dreams, and I want you to tell me what they are. The fat cows come walking up out of the river, and they're standing there all fat, and 7 skinny cows come up out of the river, and they eat the fat cows, but they're still just as skinny. And then these stalks of corn or grain, they grow up, and they're nice and great and big and juicy and fat and all this stuff, and they look really healthy. And then some skinny ones grow up beside them, and they gobble up the fat ones, but they still look all skinny and scrawny. Can you tell me what the dreams mean? And Joseph looks back and says, no, I can't tell you what the dreams mean. God can, though. God knows all dreams, so let me tell you what they mean, because God has revealed this to me. And so he gives him the interpretation. He says, 7 years of good times are coming down the road. Crops are going to be great. You're going to have so much in abundance, you won't know what to do with it all. It's going to be super, super wonderful. Everybody's getting fat and pudgy, and it's a great time. But after that, 7 years of famine will come along, and they will be so severe you won't even remember the plenteous years you had just before. 7 long years of famine. You'll get no crops. There will be no planting, there will be no harvesting, things will be horrible, people will die, there will be starvation and famine everywhere. This is going to be a big problem. This is what it is. And so what you need to do is you need to find somebody that can really manage well. You need to put them in charge of the entire land. You need to have them store up stuff from the good years so that when the bad years come, not everybody dies. Excuse me, and we can have some food stored up. Pharaoh says, aha, I have just the guy. Who in the world could possibly be wiser than the guy who interprets my dreams? Because nobody else could do it. So Joseph, guess what? You're the guy. And so Joseph is obviously taken out of jail. He's promoted to vice pharaoh. That is his new title, vice pharaoh of the entire land of Egypt, the superpower nation of the world at that time. And so we get to chapter 41, verse 33. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Let him set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. We're going to focus a little bit on that later, but Joseph says, what you need to do is impose a 20% tax on all the crops that comes in. 1/5 of everything that is grown, you need to collect it in taxes, and we're going to store it up. In verse 35, and let them gather all the food in these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for the food for the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be reserved for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. Verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all the servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in who is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all the people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. You are in charge of everything. You'll only be second to me. And that's kind of a familiar refrain for Joseph. That's exactly what happened in Potiphar's house. That's exactly what happened in the jail cell. Now it's exactly what's happening on a grander scale in all of Egypt. And Joseph is now exalted to second under Pharaoh, which, by the way, the Bible doesn't address this, but I always wonder this every time I read through. You know who that makes Joseph, who Joseph is now also boss of? Potiphar. Potiphar, who used to be over Joseph, now Joseph is Potiphar's boss. I wonder how those conversations went. Wouldn't you like to know? Maybe Potiphar's retired now. I have no idea. But I wonder what the relationship was there. Hi, Potiphar, how you doing? Great, sir. By the way, several years ago, I was innocent. You know that, right? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are absolutely innocent, sir. Thank you, sir. Just want to make that straight. All right, be on your way. I don't know how the conversation went, but that had to be interesting. Continue on, verse 45 of chapter 41. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name something that starts with a Z, and he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, not to be confused with Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. This is another curiosity to me. I've not studied it, nor have I heard it commented on, but Joseph goes and he marries the daughter of a pagan priest in the land of Egypt. Intuitively, I think this is not a great idea. But the Bible doesn't really comment on it, and I've not studied it deeply, so we're just going to put that in your mind, but we're going to keep on going. But he marries a priest's daughter, and obviously the priest there would have been one of the pagan Egyptian god priests. Carrying on. Sure enough, everything that Joseph interpreted in the dream that God had given does come to pass. 7 great years of crops, 7 years of horrible famine. Verse 53 of chapter 41, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says, do that. And that's all that Pharaoh had to do with it. Verse 56, so when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. And not only was Egypt starving, but the entire known world, the entire Middle East there was starving because of this famine. And Joseph became the bread giver. Joseph became the bread of life, if you will, to all of Egypt, but not just Egypt, to the whole known world in that area. And everybody came to Joseph for the bread of life so that they could survive. And I think this would be a fascinating and wonderful place to end the story. But there's more to it, isn't there? Because there's still some people living back in Canaan who are of interest, who are still under God's promise. And so we're going to turn our attention back to them, and the story kind of switches focus over to that half of the family now. Chapter 42, the brothers and Daddy Jacob are back in Canaan, and they are starving. They said, I hear that there is bread and grain down in Egypt that they are selling. We have to go down there, or else we will die. Verse 6, now Joseph, of chapter 42, Joseph was governor over the land, and he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from, he said. And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Boy, Joseph was quick on his feet, because as he's selling grain day after day after day, here comes this group of people. And they're really skinny looking, and they're kind of haggled and frazzled looking because they've just traveled a long way, and they're super duper hungry, and their ribs are poking out, and they're super skinny. And they walk up and they said, Sir, we would like to buy some grain, please. And Joseph looks down and he recognizes these guys. These are my brothers. And it makes you wonder, how did he come up with this plan so quick? But he looks at these guys and he said, these are my brothers. I need to know what they are like. Are they still the same brothers that I left some 15 years ago? Have they changed? Are they the same? And so Joseph decides that he is going to find out if they're the same brothers that they were. Now, he, being the master of all Egypt, cannot just look down at them and say, by the way, guys, my name is Joseph. You sold me into slavery several years ago. I'm now vice pharaoh of the superpower of the world. Are you sorry for what you did to me 15 years ago? He's probably not going to get an honest, objective response, because they would be A, shocked, B, very afraid, and C, they know their lives are threatened now because their brother that they sold off is in charge of Egypt. So he can't just ask the question. So he has to do something to pull out without them realizing what is truly in their hearts. And so he decides to recreate that same situation the best that he can from 15 years ago to see how they will respond today. And so he sets up this elaborate, can you call it a ruse, an elaborate scenario here. And so he looks at the brothers and said, you brothers, I don't believe who you say you are. You are spies. You're here to look through the land of Egypt so that you can find our weaknesses and sabotage us. Now, even saying that out loud, it sounds a little bit silly. Here's 10 skinny little scrawny guys who are starving to death from hundreds of miles away, and Joseph says, you are a threat to our nation. Get out of here. That sounds really bizarre. And so I'm sure Joseph came off as sounding a little bit unhinged to these brothers, but they start to panic. And it's fascinating towards the end of chapter 42, where they start to talk among themselves. They say, God must be getting us back for what we did to Joseph all those years ago. God, he's coming, he's punishing us. That's why these bad things are starting to happen to us. And it's amazing to me that that's the first thing that comes into their mind. 15 years ago, we did a bad thing. Now here we are in a horrible situation, and it has to be because God is punishing us. And that's the conversation they had here. But Joseph says, who are you? And they say, well, we're 10 brothers. One is at home. The other brother is dead. He's no longer around. And so we just came here, and they're stammering, and they're stuttering, and they're nervous, and they're on the spotlight, and they don't know what to say. And so Joseph says, all right, if you want to prove that you are who you say you are, you go back, and you get that other brother who's at home. You bring him back to me. He said, in fact, I'll keep all of you here in my jail as my servants. I'll send one of you back home to get the brother. He comes back. Then I'll know you're telling the truth. They sleep on it for a few days, and then Joseph come back and said, well, okay, look, I'm a good guy. I fear God. I will only keep one of you here. The rest of you go back. You get your brother, and then you come back here, and then you can have the one that I held and, have him back. That way I'll know that you are who you say you are. Makes sense. So they choose out Simeon. Poor Simeon. Simeon has to stay behind, and I don't know exactly what Simeon did while they were gone. It's been, a couple years there and back. But Simeon gets to stay in the house of Egypt. I don't know if he's in the jail. I don't know if they put him to work in the, palace or what. Who knows? Maybe he's making bricks for the Egyptians. I have no idea. But he's there in Egypt, and the rest of the brothers go home. And they get home. Well, on the way home, of course, they open their sacks. They're outside the city. They're on the way home. They open their sacks. They see the money in the top of their sacks. Now they get even more ulcers. Oh, no. He already thinks we're spies. Now all the money is here, too. It looks like we freeloaded and we stole the grain. Oh, my word. What else is going to happen? This is terrible. So they go back and they tell Daddy Jacob, Daddy Jacob, this is what's going on. When we go back, Simeon's still back there already. We have to take Benjamin back. And Daddy Jacob looks at the brothers and he says, ain't no way Benjamin's going back there. I've already lost Joseph. Now Simeon is gone. I cannot lose Benjamin too. And you start to see play out exactly what Joseph knew would be the case, that once he was out of the picture, Benjamin is the new favorite. And already Benjamin was withheld. I don't care, says Daddy Jacob, if all you guys go and get killed in Egypt, but I want my Benjamin. Clearly, Benjamin is the favorite, and he's favored. Everything that Joseph had is now transferred to Benjamin. So the brothers are already jealous, I'm sure, of Benjamin. Benjamin is at home, and Jacob says, there ain't no way I'm letting Benjamin go. We cannot do it. So they eat the grain that they have as long as they can, but the famine just keeps going and going and going. And later on we see throughout the narrative, they're not even halfway through the famine. Of course, they didn't know that. Only Joseph knew it was going to last 7 years. But they get to the end of the grain and they say, Daddy Jacob, we have to go back to Egypt. We will starve to death. And when we go, we have to take Benjamin. Sorry, not going to happen. Reuben steps up, the oldest, and says, look, make him my responsibility. Hold me personally responsible if he doesn't come back. He says, no, not going to do it. More time goes by. Finally, Judah steps up, and he says the same thing kind of that Reuben did. He said, it will be my responsibility and on my head if he doesn't come back, but we have to go. Finally, Jacob relents and said, okay, all right, you take him and go. So off they go back to Egypt. Chapter 43, the brothers return to Egypt, and Joseph's plan is well under swing. The brothers get back, and he sees them arrive. Chapter 43, verse 8, this is where Judah starts talking. Judah said to Israel his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go that we may live and not die, both we and our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I don't bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would now have returned twice. We could have gone and come back twice already, but we have to go. And the same Judah now that 15 years ago said what? Let's kill him, or at least let's sell him off. He was the instigator to get Joseph out of the way because of his jealousy and his envy and his rage against Joseph. Now he's the one saying, look, Daddy Jacob, it will be my responsibility if he doesn't come back. Has Judah changed? Has Judah changed? I see some heads shaking up and down, and it's encouraging. I'm going to maybe suggest that the jury's still out, because it's easy to say that when Daddy Jacob is staring you in the eyeballs. It's a different story when you're 100 miles away or when you're out in the back pasture and Daddy Jacob isn't there, and they say, all we got to do is say that a wild animal killed and destroyed him, and we can trick Daddy Jacob. But when Daddy Jacob is standing there staring you in the eyes, it's easy to do the right thing, isn't it? So the boys they pack up and they take off back to Egypt. They get to Egypt. Joseph sees them coming. He says, send them to my house. We are going to have lunch. So Joseph works apparently until noon, and the guys are there. They get all dressed. They get all cleaned up. They're ready to have a feast. But the brothers they're a little nervous. They said, uh-oh, it's probably because they found the money in our sacks. Now he's luring us off to a secluded spot where he can have us slaughtered or jail us or do something terrible to us, torture us or something like that. Somewhere out of the way where he can, bring us into his torture chamber in the basement or something. He's going to sabotage us. I know he is. But they get there. Joseph comes back in verse 26. In verse 26, he gets home. They brought him into the house. He asks, how are you doing? Is everything okay? He looks and he sees Benjamin again, his mother's son. It says, is this Benjamin? Is this the youngest brother that you brought back? Yes, this is him. And he gets overwhelmed and he has to go cry for a minute and be by himself. He fixes himself back up, and it's time for lunch. So they all sit down to lunch, and to the brothers' absolute amazement, of course, they have their own table, and Joseph and the Egyptians have their table. They will not eat together. That was unthinkably obnoxious and gross to have an Egyptian eat with a Canaanite. Yuck, because they have cooties. And so they sit down at their separate tables, but when the brothers sit down, they're all seated in birth order. And their eyeballs get really big, and they're looking back and forth and say, how did this happen? And there's Benjamin sitting at the end, and they start serving all the brothers their food. And when it comes time for Benjamin's food, what happens? Benjamin gets 5 times as much, way more than he can eat. Now that's impressive in itself, but remember the times here. These brothers were just on the verge of starvation. They're skinnier than skeletons right now. And they come back and they're being served lunch by the second most powerful man in Egypt. And what they crave is food because they haven't had enough to eat for months. But who gets 5 times more than all the others in this period of absolute famine? That Benjamin does. That Benjamin. Even at home, he's Daddy's favorite. And now we come here, even in Egypt, hundreds of miles away from Daddy Jacob, and even here he gets the best of everything. What is Joseph doing? He's given them every reason to be jealous of Benjamin, just like they were jealous of him 15 years ago. He's recreating the scene as best as he can, and he's given them every reason to look at Benjamin and say, oh, we got to get rid of this guy. I can't stand Benjamin. He gets the best at home. He gets the best here. Everywhere he goes, things just seem to work out for this little Benjamin. We got to get rid of him. Well, they continue to eat. Verse 34, portions were taken from them to Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of the others, and they drank and were merry with him. Chapter 44, then he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sacks with foods as much as they can carry, and send them on their way. And put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. So they pack up grains, they put their money back in quietly, but they also slip Joseph's favorite cup in one of the bags and seal it shut. And the boys load up their grain. They've just got full stomachs. They've had a great meal. Things are going surprisingly well. Benjamin got the favoritism. Fine. At least we got food. We're headed out of this place, and I can't wait to get out. They exit the city gates. They're headed down the country road. They're probably slapping each other on the back saying, wow, that went a lot better than I thought it would. I thought we were going to have a bad time there. Simeon is back with us. We kept Benjamin. Daddy Jacob's not going to be mad at us. Everything went really well. And all of a sudden, what? They start hearing police sirens coming up from behind. And they're getting closer, and they're getting closer, and they say, boys, we better pull over to let these police guys go by. I mean, we don't want any trouble. So they pull over the side of the road, waiting for the sirens to go by, and the sirens don't go by. And the police officer hops out of the car, and he walks up to their donkeys and says, hey, boys, what's going on? Hi, officer, how are you? I think you have something that belongs to Vice Pharaoh. What do you mean? There's no way we stole anything from Vice Pharaoh. Yes, one of you stole his special divination cup. Again, this has been a curiosity to me. Joseph actually, I doubt, anyway, we'll get into that later. We don't have time. His special cup, the boys say, no, there's no way we stole that. We did not steal that. We just came for grain. We had lunch with Vice Pharaoh, and now we're headed home. We did not steal anything. If anybody stole that cup, he can die. Boy, are they going to regret those words. So they say, all right, let it be as you say. He said, only the guilty one has to come back and suffer punishment. The rest of you can go home. Okay, fine, because we know it's not here. Start with Reuben. Go all the way down through the line, and sure enough, you know the story. Whose sack was it in? Poor little baby Benjamin. Daddy's favorite, Vice Pharaoh's favorite, the one that all the brothers have to be jealous of, and whose cup? Who has the cup? Ah, there's Benjamin. All right, the rest of you boys can go home. We're just going to take Benjamin off your hands, and we're going to take him back and imprison him and either enslave him or probably kill him. See you guys. Have a nice day. And the brothers have a choice, don't they? There goes Benjamin. We've never really liked Benjamin all that well. He's always Daddy's favorite. He gets the best of everything, even better than we get, just like Joseph used to. What are we going to do? This would be a super easy opportunity to say, all right, see you, Benjamin. We're headed back home. We will concoct a story for Daddy Jacob, just like we did 15 years ago to Joseph, and everything will be great. But this time their response is a little bit different, isn't it? What do they do this time? They say, no, this can't be. And so they all go back into the presence of Pharaoh. The last place they wanted to be is back in Egypt again. So they turn around and they head back in. And And Joseph, vice Pharaoh, looks at the brothers and says, "What is this you have done? After I treated you well, you go and you steal my magic cup. Didn't you know that I can tell things, I can practice my divinations and find out who has done what? And I knew you took it, and now you did. I can't believe you did this. Now he's going to stay here, and he will be my servant, or he will be my slave or my prisoner." And again, how do the brothers respond? This is the whole purpose for Joseph's entire plan here, to recreate the situation, to bring out what is within the brothers' hearts. So he's given them every opportunity to hate Benjamin and betray him just like they did him. But this time, look what they said. Judah speaks up again. The one who promised Daddy Jacob when they left, and the one who was instrumental in getting rid of Joseph the first time. He's the one that stands up, and he starts to relay the whole scenario here. I won't read it all to you. But skip down to chapter 44, verse 30. He says, "Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life," he loves him so very much, so very close, "as soon as he sees that the boy Benjamin is not with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol." If he doesn't come back, he will die with sorrow. This will kill him. "For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I don't bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame for my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy, as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father.'" Now, I will ask the same question again. Has Judah changed? Yeah. Yep. The Judah that before said, "Get rid of Joseph," now says, "Take me instead of the boy, send him back." And just like that, the experiment is over. Joseph has found out what he wanted to find out. Excuse me. And Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Says, "Brothers, I've got some news for you. Egyptian servants, please leave the room right now." And he starts speaking to them, probably in Hebrew. He says, "Brothers, my name is Joseph. And I can only imagine what's going on in the brothers' mind right now. They're going through all their luggage, trying to find all the Pepto-Bismol they can find, because they just drew 20 ulcers apiece. They've already had run-ins with this guy. He's given them a hard time. He's sent them back and forth several times. He's accused them of being spies. He's planted a cup in their sack. And now we know why, because this is the guy that we sold into slavery 15 years ago. Oh, boy. What a mess." But Joseph says, don't worry about it. Verse 4, chapter 45. "So Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come near to me, please.' And they came near, and they said, 'I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing or harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you for many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God.'" And he goes on to explain about all the things that are going on. And then, they make up a plan to go back and get Daddy Jacob and all the things. We're going to pause here for just a second to think about this for just a minute. First of all, Joseph, again, he set up this elaborate ploy to recreate the situation for the sole purpose of testing the brothers' hearts. Are they still the same brothers, or had they changed? And with that final statement, Judah confirmed that yes, the boys had changed, at least to some degree. Question for you. Was it right or was it wrong for Joseph to knowingly and intentionally put his brothers through all of those 2 years of mental torture just to find out the answer to that question? These poor brothers, like I said, they were getting ulcers on top of ulcers on top of ulcers for all this stuff. Near starvation, threat of imprisonment, threat of death, threats from Daddy Jacob, having the nerves of having to bring Benjamin in and face the second in command of Egypt. He put them through a really bad time for 2 years. Was it right or was it wrong for Joseph to have done this? What do you think? Or was he being bratty and kind of vindictive? Was it within the scope of his okayness to test the hearts of his brethren, to judge the hearts of those who had betrayed him. Was that okay? With that question in mind, let's review some of the details of Joseph's life. And I want you to see if you notice any pattern here that pops out to you. Here's what's happened in Joseph's life. He started in a low position among his brothers. He was one of the younger, but he was well favored by his father. His father loved him, but his brethren, despite he was rejected among his brethren. He is betrayed by his brother, and by the way, sold for pieces of silver to those who would betray him. He was wrongfully accused and punished. He did nothing wrong, and yet he was still punished, accused, tried and convicted for something he did not do. He was exalted eventually to the second in command of the known world, only second to Father Pharaoh himself. We find that in chapter 41, verse 40. He was 30 years old at the beginning of his ministry, it says, and he became a blessing to all the nations. He became a judge to those who harmed him, and he tried and tested their hearts. He showed mercy to those who sinned against him. And finally, he was restored to his father when his ministry was completed. And we take all these things and we ponder them in our hearts. What do we see? Who does this sound a lot like? Yeah. Could this be the seed that we were waiting for? What do you think? God had promised a seed through this family. And here's a guy who came and has all these characteristics, and he saved the known world from starvation and problems, and now he's exalted to this lofty place. Could this be the Savior, the seed? Well, unfortunately, we know that if you read through the end of the book of Genesis, we know that Joseph did something that disqualifies him from being the ultimate Savior, doesn't it? Didn't he? He did what? What did he do? He died without having sin taken care of and the relationship restored. But this does put Joseph in a very interesting line, doesn't it? We've seen several examples of what this ultimate seed might look like. Noah, he came and he rescued the world from wickedness by floating on a boat. Yet we know he wasn't the ultimate promised Savior because he died and sin was still present. And what about Isaac? He was the only begotten of Abraham, the father, and he was chosen to inherit the promise. We see him marching up the hill to be the father's sacrifice, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice on his back, to be the one and only begotten son who would be slain by his father at God's command. But he wasn't the ultimate seed either. Now we have Joseph, who have all these things in common with what we know will be someday the Savior, and yet he's not ultimately it either, but even though he is not the seed, he does give us a pretty good picture of what the seed might look like. If God were going to raise up the ultimate Savior, here's the kind of person he might be. The kind who is wrongfully accused, sold off and betrayed, suffers unjustly, restored to his brethren, yet he tries the hearts of all men to see what is in their hearts, and is restored to his Father when his mission is complete. That's a pretty good picture, especially from our vantage point today. We are going to skip, for right now, chapter 47. I want to come back to some of that, but the brothers go back and they pick up Daddy Jacob. They all come back to Egypt. Everybody's reunited, and the brothers and the family get the best of the land of Goshen. In fact, they settled just a few miles east of here in the land of Goshen. If you're watching online, you don't get that, and I'm not going to explain it to you. Chapter 47, like I said, I want to come back and revisit that later. But chapters 48 and especially 49 talk about blessings that are given to the sons. We're not going to go through all of those, but Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, but again, he crosses his hands and elevates the younger over the older, a theme that we've seen before here. Chapter 49 is the brothers' blessings. Jacob says, I'm about to die, but I want to. In fact, he doesn't just say, give you a blessing. Chapter 49, verse 1, Jacob called his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. And he doesn't call them all blessings, does he? He says, I want to tell you what's going to happen to each of your families, to each of your tribes, some better than others. Judah's an interesting one, though, in verse 8. Judah, your brother, shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you will have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. Or other translations say, until him to whom it belongs comes. Till the one who shows up to really deserve the scepter, it will stay in your hands. And to him shall be the obedience of all peoples. Clearly, Judah, who has already been kind of the de facto leader of the brothers and the instigator of all these things, is promised the rule and the authority and the leadership of the nation. And of course, we know from other biblical history that's exactly how it happens. The other brothers receive their pronouncements as well, some better than others. Joseph gets a lot of blessing for sure. Verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over a wall. Excuse me. Archers bitterly attack him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. He's really steady. Verse 25, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings from heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and the womb, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who is set apart from his brothers. So Joseph gets far away the biggest blessing in terms of prosperity and abundance and all that kind of thing. But each brother gets their pronouncement. Jacob finally dies in the end of chapter 49. Again, we don't have time to read through it all, but he is taken back then to that little cave, that little field that Abraham purchased so many, many, many years ago for Sarah, and then he's buried there, and then Isaac is buried there, and he says, I don't want to be buried here in Egypt. I want you to take me back to the one piece of property that we own back in Canaan, in the promised land. Bury me in the promised land. And so they do that. He dies. They take him all the way back there. His sons did for him as commanded, verse 12. And they take him back to the field in Machpelah, east of Mamre, that Abraham bought from the field of the sons of Heth, where he had buried. Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers who had gone up with him to bury his father, and they all come back again. Joseph's brothers get very nervous. They say, now that Dad's gone, Joseph is going to be mean to us. He reassures them that that's not the case. And that finally brings us to the last paragraph of the book of Genesis. And I think we're going to make it today, guys. Verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The generation also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. He says, I'm going to die here, but someday God will bring you out of Egypt and bring you back to the land there. I know he will. And when that happens, I want you to find my bones, pick up my coffin, and carry me back to that land. I want you to do this. And that's where Genesis ends. I think this is a fine time in the last 1 minute that we have to evaluate our situation. Jacob, he was buried in the land of promise in verse 13, and Joseph, he was buried in the land of Egypt, we see in verse 26. We have a promise that God is in the midst of fulfilling, and it looks like this. You recognize this? We've looked at this several times. Let's evaluate one more time. How is God doing on the fulfillment of his promise at the end of the book of Genesis? How about the land? Has he given them the land? Where's the family? Maybe we should start there. Are they even in the land? No, they are in the land of Egypt. This is a problem. They only possess one little field, and even nobody is living in that field. Everybody's living in a foreign land of Egypt. This is a problem. How about the nation? Has God turned them into a great nation? He's already taken Esau, and they've become a great nation, haven't they? We read about that last week. They combined with the the Seirites, and they intermixed and intermarried, and they had kings and all this kind of stuff. But what about the chosen line? What about Jacob's line? Are they a nation? There's about 70 people in the family, the Bible tells us at this point. That's a nice family reunion. That's a large Thanksgiving dinner, but it's not exactly a nation. And what about the seed, the ultimate leader? Well, even looking at their leader that they just had, Joseph, the great deliverer, the bread giver of the world, the bread of life to everyone, even he is now dead. But even he isn't the ultimate seed, the ultimate deliverer. So we have a ways to go in the fulfillment of God's promise, the promise that was made so many years ago to Abraham, way, way, way back when. Grandpa Abraham, great-grandpa Abraham now. And still we haven't really seen the promise fulfilled. Is God going to do this thing or is he not? That's where the book of Exodus comes into play. And we're going to look at Exodus next week. So I think we deserve a round of applause for getting through Genesis. Whew. We didn't think it could be done, but we did. Yes, thank you very much. Next week, we will start on the book of Exodus. If you're reading ahead or reading along, that's where we'll begin next week. And until then, let's dismiss. Dear God, we thank you for this book that you've given us so much. We've learned about who you are and who your people are and how we relate. Just from the book of Genesis, we know so much about you. We've seen you interact. We've seen how you behave. We've seen what you like, what you dislike, what you reward and what you punish. So many things we can see about your personality just from this one book. We know we have so many more books to go. Thank you for giving us your word that we can learn not just about the people or the stories, but about who you are, because you are what these stories are about in the first place. Help us to continue to see who you are through the rest of your word. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, you are dismissed.